So for thousands of years, we've basically pictured the Garden of Eden as this, mystical paradise.
Right, like a glowing magical tree, a talking snake.
Exactly. The ethereal birthplace of human souls where, God walked around in the cool of the
A
evening.
very beautiful spiritual image.
Yeah. But I want you to imagine finding a 3,000-year-old diary. And you've always been told your whole life that it's a book of beautiful spiritual poetry.
Okay, I'm with you.
And then today, we apply a radically different translation filter to it. We just strip away the
I mean,
poetry.
the theology, the mysticism,
All of it. And we just read the raw, literal vocabulary.
which changes everything.
It really does. Suddenly that diary doesn't look like poetry at all. It reads like a military flight log.
Or an agricultural and engineering manual.
Right. Suddenly Eden isn't a magical garden. It's a fenced-in, highly secured biological laboratory.
Yeah.
And Adam isn't a soul crafted from enchanted dust. He's a genetically modified workforce.
It is a profound, almost dizzying paradigm shift. I mean, you are taking texts that have been viewed through a lens of strict theology for millennia.
Thousands of years.
Exactly. And reading them as dry, historical, administrative chronicles of a physical, technological intervention on Earth.
And that is exactly our mission today. Welcome to the deep dive. We are taking the foundational texts of Western civilization, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible.
The scriptures that have shaped our laws, our morals, our wars.
Yeah. And we're asking a question that, honestly, it sounds that it belongs in a sci-fi novel, but it's actually rooted in highly rigorous linguistic analysis.
Very rigorous.
So what if the stories of Genesis, the creation of humanity, and the bloody battles of the Israelites aren't spiritual metaphors at all? What if they are literal accounts of ancient geopolitics, managed by an advanced physical race of beings?
To explore this, we are drawing on a very specific, and I should say, highly controversial stack of sources.
Very controversial.
We'll be looking at the literalist translations of ancient Hebrew texts by scholars like Mauro Biglino, who, it's worth noting, spent years translating original Hebrew texts for a major Catholic publisher before arriving at these conclusions.
He literally worked for the Vatican Press.
You did.
Mm-hmm.
We'll also cross-reference this with comparative mythology, specifically looking at how the biblical narratives mirror much older Sumerian clay tablets.
The Sumerian stuff is wild.
Oh, it really is. And finally, we will examine the provocative cultural anthropology of Laurent Guénot. He argues that these ancient, literal texts are functioning right now as the psychological operating system for modern political and military actions in the Middle East.
Right. And before we dive into the deep end of this, because we are going into some incredibly intense territory, we need to set a clear boundary for you, the listener.
Absolutely, we really do.
Because this isn't just ancient history.
No. The sources we're unpacking today contain highly charged political content, especially regarding modern Israel, Zionism, and the devastating ongoing conflict in Gaza.
Which is obviously a very sensitive topic.
Extremely. They also present theories that fundamentally dismantle traditional religious beliefs. So I want to be explicitly clear here. We are not endorsing these political viewpoints.
Not at all.
We are not taking sides in any modern geopolitical conflicts, and we are absolutely not here to attack anyone's personal faith or religious identity.
We are just looking at the blueprints, just reporting on what these specific sources say.
Precisely. Our role today is strictly as impartial guides. We're reporting on the fascinating linguistic theories and the sociological arguments presented in this specific source material to see how history, language, and ideology intersect.
Right, we're exploring the thesis to understand its mechanics, not adopting it as absolute truth.
Exactly.
Okay, with that vital context in place, let's open the book. We have to start at the literal beginning, Genesis chapter 1.
Very beginning.
Because the entire traditional translation of the Bible, the one that basically built Western civilization, relies on two massive foundational assumptions. Assumption 1, that the Hebrew word Elohim means a singular God. And assumption 2, that the verb bara means to create out of nothing.
Yes, creatio ex nihilo.
Right. Now, our sources argue that both of those assumptions are fundamentally grammatically flawed. But I have to push back immediately on behalf of everyone listening.
Sure, go ahead.
Are you telling me that thousands of years of Hebrew scholars, rabbis, and theologians just, misunderstood their own language?
Well, it's not that they misunderstood it, it's that the interpretation evolved over centuries to support a theological conclusion.
You mean monotheism?
Exactly. A conclusion that didn't actually exist when the texts were first written. Let's look at the raw mechanics of biblical Hebrew, starting with the word Elohim.
Okay, let's break it down.
In Hebrew, the suffix emin denotes a plural. It's just basic grammar. If you have a cherub, the plural is cherubim.
Okay.
A seraph becomes seraphim. So grammatically, Elohim is a plural noun. It translates literally to the gods, or if we strip away the religious connotation entirely, the powerful ones, or the judges.
But hold on. The standard explanation I learned, the one you hear in literally any theology class, is that Elohim is a plural of majesty.
Ah, yes.
Like when a human king says, "We're not amused," it's one guy, but he's so supremely important that he demands a plural pronoun to encompass his greatness.
Yes, the pluralis majestatis. It's a very common theological defense. Everyone uses it.
But there's a problem with it.
A glaring historical problem. Linguistic scholars like Biglino point out that the plural of majesty is a linguistic concept that evolved much, much later in human history.
Wait, really? When?
It originated with European monarchs, possibly tracing back to Roman emperors like Diocletian, who wanted to emphasize their dual rule over the East and West.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it simply did not exist in the ancient Near East when these texts were being compiled. When ancient Semitic scribes wrote a plural, they meant a numerical plural.
So they meant a literal group of individuals.
They're describing a group of individuals, a physical, tangible group.
Okay, so the sources argue that the text is introducing us to, like, a board of directors.
Yeah.
Or a military command structure.
Exactly.
The Elohim.
Okay, if I accept this, that the text explicitly introduces a plural group of physical beings, it completely shatters how I read the first chapter of Genesis.
Because it changes what they are actually doing.
Right. If it's a group of beings, what exactly are they doing in the darkness over the waters?
Yeah.
And that brings us to the second word, bara.
The act of creation.
Yeah. I always pictured bara as a cosmic magic trick. The universe is an empty void, and God says the word, and poof, matter exists. Creation from nothing.
Which is a beautiful philosophical concept. But again, the linguistic root of the Hebrew verb bara tells a very different story.
What does the root actually mean?
The etymological root does not mean magical creation from a void. It means to cut, to separate, to modify, to fatten, or to shape something that is already physically there.
Okay, give me an analogy here. Because cutting and shaping sounds very different from let there be light. Think of it less like a magician pulling a rabbit out of an empty hat, and more like a sculptor walking into a quarry.
Okay.
The sculptor doesn't create the rock out of thin air. The mountain is already there. The sculptor intervenes. They cut, they separate the stone, they shape it into a statue.
Right.
Or perhaps a more modern analogy that fits the paleoastronautic theory of the sources. It's like a software engineer taking an open source piece of code and updating it.
Oh, I like that.
They didn't invent the computer, and they didn't write the original base code. They arrived at a system that already existed, and they modified the software to suit their needs.
That completely changes the scale of the story. The Elohim didn't invent the universe. They arrived at a situation, a planet, a primordial ecosystem that was already functioning, and they just started terraforming it. They engineered it.
Correct. And the biblical text actually supports this plurality and physical presence in ways that traditional theology constantly has to gloss over or explain away.
Yeah, the sources pointed out Genesis 20.13, where Abraham is talking to a foreign king.
Right.
In the original Hebrew, Abraham says, "When the Elohim caused me to wander from my father's house." And the verb caused is grammatically plural. He literally says, "when the gods caused me to wander."
And then you have Psalm 82, which is perhaps the most difficult passage for strict monotheists to reconcile.
What does that one say again?
The text explicitly describes a divine assembly. It reads, Yahweh takes his stand in the council of the Elohim. He passes judgment among the Elohim.
Wow.
Theology struggles mightily with this. They usually try to demote the other Elohim to mere angels or corrupt human judges.
Because if Yahweh is the only God, who on earth is he having a council meeting with?
Exactly. But if you read it literally as a historical account, there's no theological contradiction. It's simply a boardroom meeting.
Right.
It's a localized commander addressing his peers or his subordinates within a larger hierarchical structure.
And what's wild to me is how this literal reading suddenly aligns the Bible perfectly with the rest of the ancient world. We have this habit of treating the Bible as this isolated, unique text that just dropped out of heaven.
But it was written in a region teeming with older cultures.
Exactly. The Sumerian clay tablets are older than the biblical texts by thousands of years. And when you read them side by side, they are telling the exact same operational history, just using different corporate branding.
The parallels are not just thematic, they're structural. The Sumerian texts describe a group of powerful beings called the Anunnaki, who came down from the heavens to earth to manipulate its resources.
Right.
Where the Bible has the Elohim, the Sumerians have the Anunnaki. But it goes deeper. The Bible frequently features beings called Malachim, which we traditionally translate as angels.
Right, beings with wings playing harps, floating on clouds.
But the Hebrew word malach literally just means messenger or emissary.
So no wings.
No wings. In the biblical text, before centuries of religious art added the wings, these beings are described as entirely physical. They walk, they talk, they get dirty, they eat physical food with Abraham.
They're just guys.
Yes. And in the Sumerian texts, the ruling Anunnaki have a subservient class of workers and field agents called the Ijigi.
So it's the exact same corporate org chart. You have the executive board, the Elohim or the Anunnaki, and you have the middle management or the field agents, the Malachim or the Igigi.
It matches up perfectly.
Okay, so if we follow this logic and we accept this premise for the sake of our deep dive, that the Elohim are a physical, technologically advanced group of beings modifying an existing planet, what was the ultimate goal of this intervention?
And were they building?
Yeah, what were they building? Because this logic path leads us straight to the Garden of Eden. And this is where the narrative shifts from ancient history into straight-up science fiction.
Let's re-examine the Garden of Eden through this literalist physical lens, because we really need to explore the role of the Elohim in creating the atom through what looks exactly like biblical genetic engineering.
Okay, let's do it.
In Hebrew, it is Gan Eden. Traditionally, we imagine a misty, ethereal paradise, but the linguistic root of Gan implies a physical enclosure, a walled or fenced-in area.
So it wasn't the whole planet?
Not at all. It was not a global paradise. It was a highly localized, protected, and artificially maintained environment.
A biolab, a fenced-in agricultural and genetic research facility.
Precisely. The sources compare this concept to historical and archaeological anomalies like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey.
Oh, right, the massive stone circles.
Which appeared seemingly out of nowhere, prompting hunter-gatherers to suddenly undertake massive stone construction and organized agriculture.
It's like someone handed them the blueprints.
Or even mythological parallels like the Garden of Alcinous in Homer's Odyssey, where plants are described as producing fruit continuously.
Completely ignoring natural seasonal cycles.
Yes. It implies a controlled, climate-managed environment.
So why do the Elohim need a botanical lab? Are they just really into gardening?
According to the paleoastronautic interpretation, the Elohim were engaged in heavy resource extraction, mining operations.
Oh, they were here for the minerals.
Yes. And they needed a labor force to tend to these botanical labs and extract resources. The existing hominids on Earth were not sophisticated enough to follow complex orders or utilize tools efficiently.
Right.
So the Elohim made a corporate decision to manufacture a worker, the atom. And the text explicitly tells us how they did it. They used their selim.
Okay, stop right there. Selim. Because this is another massive theological pillar. We are universally taught that this means image. God created man in his own image.
That's a traditional view.
And we are taught that image is a spiritual metaphor. It means we have a soul, or we have free will, or a rational intellect that mirrors God's intellect. We don't physically look like God because God is an invisible spirit.
Well, that is the philosophical interpretation developed by later theologians who needed God to be an omnipresent spirit. But the literal ancient Hebrew root of selim is undeniably physical.
What does it mean?
It shares linguistic roots with other Semitic languages, like Akkadian, where similar words are used to describe the cutting out of physical statues. The root relates to something cut out, or a material container that holds an essence or an image.
A material container cut out of a living being that holds their image?
Yes.
If you're listening to this and feeling a bit of vertigo, I'm right there with you. Because when you apply the context of biological modification to that definition, they aren't talking about a soul.
The sources argue that selim is the ancient primitive vocabulary trying to describe a genetic sequence, DNA.
They took their own genetic material, cut it out, and grafted it onto an existing hominid. The sources mention Homo erectus or a similar evolutionary ancestor.
Yes, in the theory, yeah.
So they take this early hominid, splice in the Elohim DNA, and boom, accelerated evolution. Homo sapiens, the worker is ready. Which means Adam isn't the name of a single magical man molded from a mud pie.
Exactly.
The atom is a classification, a genetically modified workforce. Earthlings.
And When you accept that premise, the medical precision described in subsequent biblical texts becomes startling. Let's look at the creation of Eve.
Okay, this part is crazy.
The traditional theology says God put Adam to sleep, magically pulled out a rib, and turned it into a woman. But look at the literal Hebrew. The text describes a tardima, a deep, unnaturally induced sleep.
Anesthesia. You don't need to knock someone out if you're using magic. You only need anesthesia if you're performing surgery.
Exactly. And the word traditionally translated as rib, cella, actually refers to the side of a building or the curve of a structure.
So not a rib.
In human anatomy, the sources suggest it points specifically to the iliac crest, the thick curve of the pelvic bone at your side.
Wait, why the pelvic bone and not a rib? I mean, structurally?
Because if you ask any modern orthopedic surgeon or geneticist where they go to harvest adult stem cells, they don't take a rib.
Oh, wow.
They go to the iliac crest. It is densely packed with bone marrow rich in stem cells, which are the blank biological slate needed for cloning or deep genetic engineering.
That is wild. So the text is describing an entity administering anesthesia, extracting biological material rich in stem cells from the iliac crest, using it to engineer a female counterpart, and then, as the biblical text explicitly notes, he closed up the flesh.
Yes.
It reads exactly like a post-operative surgical report.
It does. We are reading the accounts of ancient desert nomads trying to describe a surgical cloning procedure using the limited vocabulary of their time. He put him in a deep sleep, took a piece of his side, and closed the meat.
And because they used the Selim, because we literally shared DNA with the Elohim, we were biologically compatible with them. Which brings us to a part of the Bible that always terrified me in Sunday school, mostly because the teachers just rushed past it. Genesis chapter 6.
The narrative of the Nephilim. The text states that the sons of the Elohim saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, or more accurately translated in this context, suitable or fit, and they took them as wives. They mated with them.
But cross-species breeding shouldn't be possible? I mean, a human can't mate with a chimpanzee, let alone an alien.
Unless, as the paleoastronautic theory posits, the genetic link had already been established via the coelom. Because human females possessed Elohim DNA, crossbreeding was biologically viable.
And the result of this unauthorized crossbreeding were the hybrids. Genesis calls them the Giborim, the mighty men of old, men of renown.
Yes.
If you look at world history, these are the demigods of ancient myth. Gilgamesh in Sumeria, Achilles and Hercules in Greece. The sources are arguing that these aren't just fictional fairy tales invented around campfires.
No, they are historical memories of a hybridized, genetically superior ruling class.
A hybridized class that introduced a massive problem for the Elohim: control. If your workforce is breeding with your executive class, the lines of authority break down completely.
And control is the central driving theme of this entire narrative. And one of the primary methods of asserting the control over the human population was biological limitation, specifically limiting the human lifespan.
Right, because if you read the early genealogies in Genesis, people are living absurdly long times. Methuselah lives to be, 969 years old?
That's what the text says.
We always assume they just counted months as years, or it was a metaphor.
But if we maintain our literal reading, it wasn't an exaggeration. Modern genetics understands that aging is largely a cellular process specifically. The degradation of telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of our chromosomes.
Like the plastic tips on shoelaces.
Exactly. Every time a cell divides, the telomere gets shorter. When it's gone, the cell degrades, and we age and die. If an advanced civilization possessed the genetic technology to splice DNA, they certainly possessed the medical therapies to maintain telomere length, effectively halting the aging process.
The biblical tree of life wasn't a magic apple tree. It was a genetic therapy regimen.
Precisely. The Elohim had access to it, and initially so did some of the early human leadership. But as the population exploded, and especially as the unauthorized hybridization with the Nephilim caused chaos, the Elohim actively intervened to cap the human lifespan.
Oh, I see.
In Genesis 6.3, the deity explicitly states that man's days shall be limited to 120 years.
120 years specifically.
It forces rapid generational turnover. If humans live for centuries, they accumulate immense knowledge, wisdom, and potentially power. They become a threat.
Right.
But if they die after a few decades, they are in a constant state of biological churn. It's planned obsolescence. They engineered a workforce that would literally expire before it could organize or rebel.
It's horrifyingly pragmatic. You build a workforce, but if you have a constantly breeding, rapidly dying, high turnover population, you run into another massive logistical problem.
Food.
Yeah, food.
Yeah.
Hunter-gathering won't cut it for a booming, centralized slave population. How did the Elohim feed them?
This is where the biological evidence becomes fascinating. The sources highlight an agricultural anomaly regarding wheat.
Wheat.
Yes. Dario Bressanini, an Italian chemist and science communicator, points out that modern wheat, the foundational crop of human civilization, is a genetic anomaly. It is what he calls a genetic monster.
Explain the mechanism there, because I buy wheat at the grocery store and it doesn't look like a monster.
Well, in its original wild state, ancient wheat, einkorn had 14 chromosomes. But suddenly, as human civilization was taking off in the Fertile Crescent, we see the emergence of emmer wheat, which has 28 chromosomes.
Wait, it just doubled. How does that happen naturally?
The scientific term is polyploidy. In nature, for a plant to double its chromosomes, it requires an incredibly rare random genetic mutation, essentially an error in cell division where chromosomes duplicate but the cell fails to divide.
Okay.
Traditional botany assumes that this miraculous error happened naturally, and ancient primitive farmers somehow recognized it and cultivated it perfectly to create a stable, high-yield crop.
But the paleoastronautic theory looks at that and says, there's no way primitive humans pulled that off by accident.
Exactly. If you have just engineered a massive new workforce of humans, you need a high-yield, calorically dense food source to sustain them, and you need it immediately.
Right.
The sudden, dramatic genetic leap from 14 to 28 chromosomes wasn't a lucky natural accident. It was deliberate, calculated agricultural engineering by the Elohim to mass-produce fuel for their new workers.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and look at the world we have just reconstructed. We have a planet divided into operational territories managed by a board of directors called the Elohim.
Right.
They have a genetically modified workforce that they feed with genetically engineered crops. They enforce strict lifespan limits via genetic manipulation to maintain total control. If you are listening to this and this is your first time hearing these theories, it fundamentally breaks the religious mold.
Yes, it is a huge departure.
Because the immediate burning question is, where does the God of the Old Testament fit into this? Where does Yahweh fit into a corporate military structure of aliens?
This is the pivot point where the entire theological paradigm shatters. According to the literalist translations of the texts, Yahweh is not the supreme, universal creator of the cosmos. He is not the omnipotent, omnipresent spirit.
Yeah.
No. Yahweh is just one specific, localized Elohim. He is a middle manager, or more accurately, a military commander assigned to one specific territory and one specific human asset.
I know there is a specific verse that scholars point to for this.
Yes, Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9. It is the smoking gun for this theory.
What does it say?
The text says that when the Most High, the Hebrew word used is Elion, divided the nations of the earth among humanity, he set up boundaries according to the number of the sons of God, or the Elohim.
So Elion is the CEO of the Elohim.
Yes, Elion is dividing up the global map.
Mm.
And the text continues in verse 9. But Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob, his allotted heritage.
Wow. He explicitly says that Yahweh was assigned his portion by a higher authority. Elion says, okay, Marduk, you get the territory of Babylon, Chemosh, you get the Moabites, and Yahweh, you get this wandering tribe of Jacob.
Exactly.
Yahweh isn't the God of everything. He is exclusively the God of them.
And when you view Yahweh, not as an all-loving cosmic spirit, but as a localized military governor assigned to manage a landless, vulnerable tribe in a hostile desert, all of his seemingly bizarre, cruel, and obsessive behavior in the Old Testament suddenly makes terrifying logical sense.
It totally does. We read the book of Leviticus, and we are told these are spiritual purity laws. Don't eat pork, wash your hands in specific ways, isolate people with skin conditions outside the camp.
But in the context of a desert march with a massive civilian and military population, those aren't spiritual metaphors. Those are the strict survival protocols of an army camp.
That makes perfect sense.
He is enforcing rigid hygiene and dietary laws to isolate his troops from neighboring populations, to prevent the spread of parasites like trichinosis from pork, and to maintain group cohesion. He's keeping his asset healthy, quarantined, and combat ready.
And he maintains authority over this camp using overwhelming technological might, which the ancient text describes using vocabulary that sounds exactly like UFO sightings.
The aerial phenomena.
Yeah, let's talk about the kavod. The Bible constantly talks about the glory of the Lord, The glory descended on Mount Sinai.
Yes, but the Hebrew word translated as glory is kavod. Its literal root meaning is heavy, weighty, or dense.
Heavy.
When the kavod appears in the text, it is not described as a glowing spiritual aura. It is often accompanied by descriptions of fire, thick smoke, tremendous deafening noise, and the violent shaking of the ground.
Right.
When Yahweh descends on Mount Sinai in his kavod, the mountain smokes like a furnace, the people are terrified by the sound, and the earth trembles.
It sounds exactly like a heavy, noisy, exhaust-spewing aerospace vehicle, a dropship landing. And then there's the Ruach, which gets translated as the Spirit of God hovering over the waters.
Ruach literally means wind or breath.
Right.
In the context of aerial phenomena, it perfectly describes the downward thrust of a hovering craft, a smaller, quieter drone or a hovercraft moving over the surface.
And we cannot talk about Yahweh's tech without talking about the Ark of the Covenant. I always pictured the Indiana Jones box, this magical gold chest holding the 10 Commandments.
Look at the actual highly specific instructions for the Ark in the book of Exodus. It had to be built using acacia wood and then completely lined inside and out with pure gold.
Okay, what does that mean from an engineering standpoint?
Gold is one of the most excellent electrical conductors found in nature. Acacia wood, especially in a dry desert environment, is an excellent electrical insulator.
Right.
If you build a box where an insulator is sandwiched between two layers of conductive material, in modern electronics, you have just built a dielectric capacitor,
Wait, really?
a device designed to store and discharge massive amounts of electrical energy.
A giant battery. Or a weapon, which explains why there were such incredibly strict rules about touching it.
Exactly. If you touch the ark without proper grounding or the specific protective garments the priests were ordered to wear, it killed you instantly.
Like Uzzah.
We see this happen in the text to a man named Uzzah, who reaches out to steady the ark when it's on a cart, touches it, and is struck dead on the spot. It wasn't divine wrath, it was a lethal electrical discharge.
It's all physical, it's all mechanics. But my favorite detail, or maybe the most disturbing detail regarding Yahweh's physical reality, has to do with the sacrifices.
The sacrifices.
I used to read the Bible and wonder, why does an omnipotent spiritual God who created the galaxies care if a nomadic shepherd burns a goat on an altar?
The book of Leviticus is obsessively specific about this. Yahweh did not just want meat burned. He specifically demanded the burning of the animal fat, the suet.
The fat, specifically.
And the text repeatedly states that this specific smoke created a pleasing aroma to the Lord. Now, why would a technologically advanced entity care about the smell of burning fat? The sources point straight to neurobiology and biochemistry.
Explain this, because it's fascinating.
When you burn specific animal fats, especially the kidneys and the liver fat that Yahweh requested, it releases chemical compounds called pyrazines. Furthermore, the sources suggest the smoke contains compounds that interact with the endocannabinoid system.
The same system in the human brain that reacts to cannabis.
Yes. It acts as a biological calmative, a psychotropic relaxant. Consider the environment. These beings, the Elohim, are operating in the harsh environment of Earth, managing a difficult, rebellious human population. It affected their nervous systems. Inhaling this specific, dense smoke acted as a tranquilizer.
It's the exact same chemical reaction that makes humans feel a sense of primal satisfaction and calm when they smell a barbecue or sizzling bacon. It literally triggers a happy response in the brain.
Exactly.
So Yahweh wasn't smelling it for spiritual appeasement. He was hotboxing his command tent with barbecue smoke to relieve stress.
It is a shockingly visceral image. A stressed military commander self-medicating with the smoke of the camp.
So if Yahweh is just a localized commander imposing these strict, isolated laws on his specific troops, how did his governing style compare to the other Elohim? Because he wasn't the only one managing human populations. What was happening next door in Egypt, for example? We really need to delve into the contrast between Israel's biblical ideology and the Egyptian social views of the gods.
This is a crucial comparative analysis. To understand the uniqueness and the danger of the ideology Yahweh imposed on Israel, we have to look at the surrounding civilizations.
Right.
Let's look at the Egyptian perspective, as extensively analyzed by scholars like the Egyptologist Jan Assmann in his work on memory and monotheism. In ancient Egypt, the gods, they called them the Neteru, were viewed fundamentally as social beings.
Social beings, meaning they hung out together in a pantheon.
Essentially, yes. They existed in a divine society.
Yeah.
And their harmonious interactions with one another guaranteed the harmony of the universe, a concept the Egyptians called ma'at. cosmic order.
Okay, that makes sense.
Furthermore, because their gods were social, the Egyptians understood that other nations had their own gods. There was a concept we call the translatability of polytheism.
Meaning, if an Egyptian merchant traveled to Babylon, he didn't think the Babylonians were worshipping fake demons.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He might recognize the Babylonian god of the sun, Shamash, as simply a different cultural manifestation or a different name for the Egyptian sun god, Ra. It was a diplomatic, inclusive, and highly stable worldview. It allowed different cultures to interact and trade without existential religious warfare.
And then you have Yahweh, who is the absolute polar opposite of inclusive.
Yeah.
He is profoundly, violently antisocial.
Yahweh introduces a concept that was radically alien and disruptive to the ancient world. Exclusive monolatry.
Which means?
The demand that you worship only him, which eventually evolved into strict monotheism, the belief that only he exists. He explicitly identifies himself as a Elkanah, a jealous god. He demands not just loyalty, but the complete and utter destruction of any competing ideology.
Look at Deuteronomy chapter 12. He doesn't just say, hey, focus on me, don't pray to those other guys.
No.
He orders the Israelites to smash their sacred stones, burn their sacred poles, tear down their altars, and wipe the very names of the other gods from the land. It is a scorched earth policy on competing cultures.
Yes, very aggressive.
Compare that to the Romans centuries later. The Romans were so terrified of accidentally offending a god they might have missed, they literally built an altar to the unknown god in Athens.
Right.
Just to cover their bases.
The Romans absorbed the gods of the people they conquered to integrate them into the empire. Yahweh demands the absolute annihilation of competing gods to completely isolate his people. And what's fascinating is how much the Israelites themselves resisted this unnatural exclusivity. They were constantly trying to revert to the polytheistic norm of the entire region.
Right, because serving multiple gods was simply how the world worked back then. It was the baseline of reality. The sources highlight this incredible telling moment in the book of Joshua, chapter 24.
Yes. Shechem.
Joshua gathers all the tribes at Shechem. This is decades after they left Egypt. They've been wandering the desert, they've been fighting wars, and Joshua tells the people, put away the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates and in Egypt.
The grammatical tense there is vital. It is in the present imperative tense. Put away the gods.
Which means they were still worshiping them. Decades after the Exodus, decades of Yahweh raining down fire and performing miracles, the Israelites were still actively polytheistic.
They were.
They were still keeping statues of the Egyptian Elohim in their tents. It proves that a multi-god reality was the accepted, lived experience of the people, and Yahweh's demand for total, isolated exclusivity was a harsh, imposed military conditioning. It wasn't natural to them.
It was an ideological quarantine.
Yeah.
Yahweh was forcibly isolating their minds, just as he isolated their bodies with dietary and hygiene laws.
But here's where this deep dive gets really interesting, and a little dark. Because this harsh, isolationist military conditioning, it didn't just disappear when the biblical era ended.
No, it did not.
The physical Elohim may have left the planet or hidden themselves, but the cultural programming remained. How did centuries of this specific brutal conditioning affect the cultural DNA of the people long term? This brings us to the highly controversial work of Laurent Guyena. We're going to adopt a critical approach based on cultural anthropology and Guyeno's analysis to examine how ancient scriptures influence modern Israeli collective mentality.
And we must tread very carefully here, as we stated in our disclaimer. Laurent Guyena presents an anthropological and sociological analysis of cultural inheritance. I want to remind our listeners that we are exploring a thesis presented in the sources, examining how ancient historical texts shape modern cultural behavior. We are not inversing clinical or psychological labels applied to any modern populations.
Absolutely. We are looking at a sociological argument about the downstream effects of ancient software. Guyena argues that analyzing modern Israeli leadership, or the state's geopolitical actions, through the lens of individual clinical psychology, for instance, calling a specific leader a psychopath is both useless and inaccurate.
Right.
Instead, he applies Sigmund Freud's concept of collective neurosis.
To understand this, we need to briefly explain Freud's theory. In works like Moses and Monotheism, Freud argued that religions operate as a form of collective neurosis.
What does that mean, practically?
By providing a shared, culturally accepted framework of rituals and beliefs, religion immunizes the individual against personal individual psychosis. It normalizes behavior that, if done by a single person in isolation, would be considered pathological.
Okay, I follow.
Guyena takes this Freudian framework a step further. He argues that due to their specific history with Yahweh, the nation exhibits a collective psychopathy that is rooted entirely in its biblical software.
A collective worldview downloaded directly from the character profile of Yahweh. Because if Yahweh is your ultimate role model, and Yahweh is an angry, jealous, isolationist commander who routinely orders the total extermination of neighboring tribes, that becomes your moral baseline.
Genena unpacks the traits of this cultural imprint by comparing it to individual pathology. In an individual psychopath, you see a profound lack of empathy for others, a deeply ingrained belief in their own absolute innocence regardless of their actions, and a supreme, unshakable self-justification. On a collective, cultural level, Guénon argues this manifests as a structural lack of empathy for outgroups, anyone who is not part of the chosen tribe.
Wow.
It manifests as a deep-seated belief in the absolute, permanent innocence of the nation, where any hostility from the outside world is viewed strictly as irrational hatred and never as a reaction to the nation's own geopolitical actions.
And crucially, he points out a cognitive distortion. They confuse the group's specific localized well-being with the well-being of all humanity. If a policy is good for the tribe, it is by definition good for the world because they are the chosen tribe of the commander. And Guénon is very clear to state, this is not genetic. It's not biology or race.
Yeah, exactly.
It is entirely a cultural inheritance. It is software, continually reinstalled in the human hardware generation after generation.
And how exactly is that software installed so permanently? The sources point to the physical impact of religious ritual on the architecture of the brain. The Jewish scholar Shazar Hell writes extensively about the Shema Israel, the foundational daily prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one.
She talks about the obsessive daily repetition of these specific words. A child hears it from the womb, literally feeling the vibration of the words through the uterine wall as the mother prays, and they repeat it daily until their deathbed.
Modern neuroscience provides the mechanism for why this works. There's a concept in neuroplasticity called Hebb's law, which simply states, neurons that fire together wire together.
So repetition actually changes the brain structure.
Yes. The obsessive structured repetition of these specific exclusionary prayers chemically carves neural pathways into the brain. It physically builds a specific, isolated worldview into the architecture of the mind. It creates hardwired filters through which all external information is interpreted.
You are literally programming the brain to view the entire world as a binary us versus them, with us being commanded by a deity who demands absolute exclusivity. And to understand how extreme and unyielding this programming is, you just have to look at the stories they pass down as their ultimate moral lessons.
The Amalekites.
Yes, the story of King Saul and the Amalekites. Let's look at that.
In the first book of Samuel, Yahweh orders King Saul to enact a policy of total warfare. The Hebrew word is harem against a rival tribe, the Amalekites. The command from Yahweh is explicit and horrifying. Total extermination. Men, women, children, infants, and even the livestock. Leave absolutely nothing alive.
It's a direct command for total genocide. But Saul goes in, his army wins the battle, but he has a brief human moment of mercy. He spares the rival king, Agag, and he keeps some of the best sheep and cattle alive, perhaps as spoils or for sacrifice.
And how does Yahweh, the commander, react? Is he pleased by this minor show of human mercy?
Nope.
No, he's furious. He sends the prophet Samuel to strip Saul of his kingship. He rejects Saul entirely and permanently.
Because he didn't follow orders. The moral lesson that is burned into the cultural memory for 3,000 years isn't thou shalt not kill. The lesson is that empathy for the outgroup is a punishable offense.
Exactly.
Absolute, unquestioning obedience to the commander's orders, even if those orders are to slaughter infants, is the only true definition of morality.
It is a terrifying moral framework when analyzed objectively. Good is defined solely as strict obedience to Yahweh. Evil is defined solely as disobedience to Yahweh. Universal human empathy does not factor into the equation at all. In fact, within this military framework, empathy is a vulnerability that will get you destroyed and stripped of your rank.
So what does this all mean for us today? Because if this ancient blood-soaked text is the cultural operating system, how does it manifest when the descendants of this text wield modern state power, modern jet fighters, and nuclear weapons?
It brings us from ancient history directly to the present day. We have to examine how biblical narratives justify current, modern political and military choices.
Right, because this biblical ideology isn't just history locked away in a museum display case. The sources argue it is the active, literal blueprint for modern Zionism and Israeli state policy.
It is practically impossible to separate the geopolitical actions of the modern state from the ancient biblical narrative. The sources argue that even the secular, ostensibly non-religious founders of Israel operated entirely within this biblical paradigm. Take David Ben-Gurion, the primary founder and first prime minister of the State of Israel.
The guy didn't even go to synagogue. He famously ate pork. He was, by all functional definitions, a secular socialist.
Yet his biographers note that he viewed the geopolitical world entirely through a biblical lens. He did not see the 1948 creation of Israel merely as a political mandate from the United Nations. He viewed it as a literal, historical continuation of the book of Joshua.
Wow.
He saw himself leading the new Israelites to conquer Canaan. He even famously prophesied that Jerusalem would one day become the supreme court of all humanity, directly fulfilling the prophecies of Isaiah. The modern secular state was built explicitly on a biblical bedrock.
And we see this ancient software executing right now on our screens in the current devastating conflict in Gaza. The rhetoric used by leadership isn't just political or strategic, it's deeply, terrifyingly biblical. You look at statements from modern leaders like Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he explicitly frames modern urban warfare using ancient scriptures.
Netanyahu frequently utilizes this biblical framing to justify immense military action to both his domestic audience and the world. He has described the conflict in binary terms as a battle between the people of light and the axis of evil, and he has explicitly referenced the realization of Isaiah's prophecies as a justification for the war's objectives.
Yeah, Isaiah 60, he actually quoted this, where the ancient text states that nations who will not serve Israel will perish and be completely exterminated.
Yeah.
When a head of state with a modern military quotes an ancient text demanding the extermination of non-compliant nations while managing a modern war, that is prophecy weaponized as foreign policy. It acts as a divine mandate, bypassing international law.
We saw another stark, incredibly telling example of this in 2015. Netanyahu addressed the U.S. Congress regarding the perceived nuclear threat of Iran. He specifically and deliberately timed his speech to coincide with the Jewish holiday of Purim.
Purim, which celebrates the story of the Book of Esther.
Exactly. In his speech, he directly compared modern Iran to the Persian viceroy Haman, the villain of the Book of Esther, who plotted to exterminate the Jews in antiquity. He used this biblical narrative to frame Iran as an existential threat, justifying preemptive, aggressive action.
But what he leaves out of the speech, or rather what the audience in Congress might not realize if they haven't read the end of the book, is how the Book of Esther actually resolves. It doesn't end with a peace treaty or a diplomatic solution.
No, it does not.
It ends with the Jewish people having been given permission by the king, slaughtering 75,000 Persians in a massive preemptive strike. When a leader invokes Esther on the global stage, they aren't invoking a defense strategy, they're invoking a historical precedent for mass preemptive slaughter.
It highlights how these ancient narratives are not perceived merely as stories or metaphors. They are perceived as cyclical, inevitable historical truths. The enemies simply change names over the millennia: Amalekites, Philistines, Persians, Hamas, Iran. But the narrative of the existential threat and the justified, overwhelming, violent military response remains identical, dictated word for word by the ancient text.
And the most mind-bending part of all of this, tying it right back to the physical land of Gaza, is the disinformation inherent in the ancient text itself. The sources point out a fascinating textual anomaly in the book of Judges, chapter 1. It's a brief account regarding the original conquest of Gaza.
Yes. If you read the Septuagint, which is the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, often considered to be based on older, more original manuscripts, it says clearly that the tribe of Judah failed to conquer Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron.
Failed. Why?
Because the inhabitants of the plains possessed advanced military technology. Iron chariots. Judah was outgunned, so they retreated to the mountains.
But if you read the Hebrew Masoretic text, which was codified centuries later and is the basis for almost all modern Bibles today, it says the exact opposite.
Yeah.
It says Judah successfully conquered Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ekron.
It is a blatant, deliberate textual contradiction regarding the exact same strip of land that is the epicenter of global conflict today.
It's ancient fake news. It's political propaganda from thousands of years ago, altering the historical record to claim a military victory that didn't actually happen, solely to justify territorial claims for future generations. And today, in the 21st century, people are fighting, bleeding, and dying over that exact same piece of land, driven by texts that can't even agree on whether they conquered it in the first place.
It perfectly encapsulates the enduring physical and lethal power of these texts. A discrepancy in a scroll written millennia ago by a scribe with a political agenda can directly influence the drawing of borders and the dropping of bombs today.
Okay, let's take a breath and recap this incredible heavy journey for everyone listening. We started by taking a scalpel to the vocabulary of theology. We stripped the spiritual gloss off the Hebrew words Elohim and bara, and we discovered a gritty, physical account of genetic engineering, where a workforce was spliced together from hominid DNA using stem cells from the iliac crest.
We then explored how this new workforce was managed by a network of territorial warlords, specifically focusing on Yahweh, a localized commander who instituted a harsh isolationist regime over a desert tribe utilizing advanced aerospace weaponry and biochemical pacification.
And then we saw how that ancient military conditioning didn't just fade into history. According to anthropologists, it programmed a collective neurosis, a cultural software that views empathy for outsiders as a punishable weakness and total isolation as a divine mandate. Finally, we arrived at the modern day, where those exact ancient military campaigns are literally being quoted by heads of state to bypass international law and justify modern geopolitical warfare.
The through line is unbroken. From the biolabs of Eden to the front lines of Gaza, the narrative dictated by the Elohim continues to unfold, driving human history.
So to you listening right now, I want you to think about the foundational texts of your own culture. The books you swear on in court, the myths you teach your kids. How much of what we consider spiritual truth or divine morality is actually just the sanitized, repackaged history of ancient politics and warfare? And how much of our modern politics is secretly being driven by the ghosts of these ancient commanders?
I will leave you with one final, deeply provocative thought to ponder. If the paleoastronautic theory holds any weight whatsoever, if the gods were indeed advanced, physical beings who manipulated humanity for cheap labor, resource extraction, and their own colonial agendas, it completely reframes the entirety of human religion.
Awesome.
It means that early humanity suffered the profound existential trauma of colonization, slavery, and genetic manipulation by a vastly superior force. And over thousands of years, in order to cope with that unbearable trauma, we desperately rewrote the narrative. We transformed our alien overlords into a loving spiritual father. We turned our enslavement into a story of divine purpose. What does it say about the resilience and the ultimate tragedy of the human condition that our greatest, most beautiful spiritual traditions might actually be our most profound psychological coping mechanisms for an ancient cosmic trauma?
Our greatest religion's acting as a global trauma response. That is incredibly heavy, and it changes everything. We wanted a simple, clean diagnosis of our history. But looking closely at these texts reveals a landscape that is deeply, fundamentally complex and frankly a bit terrifying. And the muddy waters of the past are still flooding our present. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the texts, keep examining the foundations, and never stop looking at the world with a critical eye.